to get away. Yeah, I mean, you've got to be of a certain age, right? And then it goes.
Sometimes you wanna go.
It's on that version, it's got a second verse, but then it goes. Sometimes you gotta go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came, and so on and so forth. Sorry? No, Friends. Who wants to start the theme to Friends? When the rains, and actually that is apposite. So. What is Cheers about? What is it about? It's a bar. It's a bunch of people who go to the pub. That's what that whole TV program was about. What is Friends about?
They go to a coffee house.
Yeah, they're people that hang together and like go to the coffee and like get into romantic couples with each other. Yeah. Well, and has anybody seen Community? Yeah. What is Community about? Yeah. And again, hopefully something is emerging. There is something about why are we entertained by just groups of people being in each other's company in these different settings? So I was going through it in my head, and most of these are American, but there are just like an endless number of them. Like Cheers was the one that came to mind because of the theme song. Then there's Friends, then there's Community, then there's Superstore, if you've seen that, I'm a fan of Superstore, which is in the workplace, but it's still about a group of people who kind of help each other and kind of irritate each other and develop each other in some way. And then what other ones are there? The Big Bang Theory. Who's seen the Big Bang Theory? What's that? That is just the same thing over and over again. Why are we so taken up with these things which are effectively, I mean, I think the one Community just kind of names it. It's basically these things, and the thing which we point to entertain us is community, and groups of people who support and encourage and help each other along, and sometimes irritate each other. But it is a real. Once you begin to look at it, you will see it everywhere, all the time. All our stories, all our kind of entertainments are effectively about people that kind of hold together. And another thing that's interesting about that is that usually they're increasingly not about families, but they are about groups of friends or colleagues. These are just one of hundreds of fragments out there in our popular culture which speak of our deep desire for the comfort of living in community, for the comfort of friendship. Nothing is so wonderful and so life-giving as community, wouldn't you say? Like in the different forms that we find it. It's how we're built. So let's start here. In Genesis, when you're reading the early, the scholars say, well, actually, if you think about Genesis, there are actually two creation stories. They're just different ways of addressing the same thing. But in the first one, everything is good, isn't it? God makes light and it's good. God makes the sun and the moon and it's good. And God makes animals and they're good. And God makes the seas and it's good. And everything's good until there is one thing that is not good. Have you noticed that? What's the not good thing? It's not good for this human being to be alone. So everything is good until there is one thing which is not good, and that is for the human to be alone. So the Christian doctrine of Trinity, this is just an introduction, and it's already a little bit heavy, but if you think about it, the Christian idea of Trinity says that before there was anything, before the world existed, before the universe existed, before anything came into being, that there was loving relationship. In the Godhead, in God himself, there is loving relationship between the persons of the Trinity. Before anything else, there is already love. So when human beings are made in the image of God, is it a surprise that they need community? It's not a weakness, it's not a flaw, it's not a mistake God made. It's not a bug in the system. It is a reflection of the character of God himself. It is not good for man to be alone. And, of course, the absence of this sense of fellowship, this community, is such pain. In its presence there's so much joy, and that's why it makes for such comforting kind of comfort blanket entertainment. And all these TV programs have their emotional and their psychological premise, if you like. Their psychological premise is the healing and formative power of community. Therefore, on the flip side of that, nothing is so difficult as being shut out from community, of being excluded. And isn't that another fragment that we see around us in our contemporary culture, which is so anxious and fearful of groups of people or individuals being excluded from community? That's just about the worst thing that I think there's a kind of common public value that's got to be high up there. We want to reject and push away exclusion, if you see what I mean. But then, to take another twist on this road, nothing is so difficult as community. Nothing is so disappointing as community. So nothing is so joyful as community when you have it. Nothing is so painful as its absence. But then when you do receive it, nothing is so difficult as true community. It can be painful. It can be awkward. It can be disjointed. When we end up in community with people, we end up rubbing up against them, and there's friction and heat. That happens even in church, doesn't it? Have you ever had a stand-up argument with someone in church? Or been told off by someone in church? Because if you haven't, I think that might be a problem. But anyway, that's another thing. But think back to Genesis. However we understand, so whether you so there are lots of people who would say, no, this is a literal 7-day creation, and no, this is not. This is something else. This is something more kind of mythical and storied and metaphorical. However you understand it, something happens in the garden which results in alienation, like a brokenness in relationship. Human beings from God, human beings from their vocation. God says, to Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. You'll never have a day's peace. Your vocation is spoilt. The humanity's vocation to care for creation experiences this brokenness. Humans from their own bodies. Have you ever thought about that? That weird thing about childbirth in that story where God says, childbearing will bring pain. Why is that? It strikes me, I feel like it's a kind of brokenness from our own bodies. There's an alienation of human beings from the earth in that loss of vocation. And of course, ultimately, there's an alienation of human beings from each other. So what is Adam's incredibly cheeky excuse for his sin and rebellion? He says, it's the woman that you put here with me. So in one kind of rhetorical flourish, blaming both the woman and God himself for Adam's own sin. And Adam inverts the gift of community into a curse. That's what he's saying. And he attacks both the gift, Eve, and the giver, God, and say, it's your fault. And how often does that happen? Just in life. It's not me, I'm trying my hardest, I'm doing my best, it's everybody else. We do that all the time. So we're alienated not from just from God and from our vocation, from the world, even from our own bodies, but from each other. So part of what the gospel does is it utterly transforms the way we relate to each other. So some of those things that Sid was speaking about last week, the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, what are they? They are factors of the way that we relate to other people. It makes no sense to speak about gentleness if there's nobody else around, if you never interact with anybody else. It makes no sense to speak about patience unless there are other people in the room. It makes no sense to speak about kindness unless you're being kind to someone. There is an other. So the fruit of the Spirit is a reformation in how we relate to other people. Does this make sense so far? Is that fair? You seem unsure. It seems to me also that those renewed relationships are a sign that something has happened to remake us, as human beings. And it's those things which are the most true, most real, most powerful sign that God is real and that he has done something with humanity to change our ultimate destiny. Like, we kind of think, well, if God would show up and kind of wave a kind of God wand and kind of fix this, that and the other, then we would believe in him. But it seems to me that the most profound sign is that human beings are remade in their relationships to each other. So think about the Gospel of John. Now, scholars call the Gospel of John the Book of Signs. They call it the Book of Signs because it's structured, at least in part, around 7 signs. And the book is referring all the time, the Gospel of John is referring all the time to these signs. So there's the changing of water into wine at Cana in chapter 2. And then the Gospel of John says, and this was the first sign. So it's kind of flagging it. And then there's a bunch of other signs. And then in John chapter 20, it says, in 30 to 31, it says, therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in these books, but they have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing in him you may have life in his name. So there were many, many signs that are just not written down here, but they're all written down here so that you believe that Jesus really was the Son of God, and he has acted to renew and restore humanity. And that in believing in him, you can have life in his name, you can have life, a new life. So, there are those 7 signs, but there is, and this is not counted among the signs, but I think it should be, there is another sign, not a sign for the disciples, but a sign for the world. Jesus says, I think it's in John chapter 13, by this the world will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. That you love one another. So the love of Christians for each other is not a sign to the Christian, but a sign to the world that God is real and that God has acted to renew our humanity and to give us new life. This is just an introduction. I have come, this is what Leslie Newbegin, who was a missiologist, he was an interesting guy. He trained as a missionary. He went out to India for like 15 years, then he came back to the UK. And his experience was of a culture shock. Not actually speaking of, he experienced a culture shock going to India, but then he experienced a culture shock coming back to the UK. And he said everything has changed. And he wrote a bunch of books about that kind of sentiment, and one which is a gospel in a pluralist society contains this comment. I have come to feel that the primary reality of which we have to take account in seeking for a Christian impact in public life is the Christian congregation. The most important thing is the Christian congregation. How is it possible that the gospel should be credible? How is it possible? How can it have credibility in the world that we have? That people should come to believe that the power which has the last word in human affairs is represented by a man hanging on a cross. I'm suggesting that the only answer, the only hermeneutic of the gospel is a congregation of men and women who believe it and live by it. So we are the sign. We are a sign. We should be a sign. The church as a whole and in its local congregations should be a sign to the world, the most profound, the most truthful, the deepest, the most authentic sign that God is real and is acting to give us new life. Anyway, we should get to Galatians, shouldn't we? Because we are now on the penultimate talk in our series on Galatians, from Galatians chapter 6. And Paul, in all his writings, is profoundly concerned about the wholeness of the church and the way that people in the church deal with each other. And it's about a theological wholeness and a doctrinal consistency, if you like, and the importance of that. But that only ever kind of expresses itself in its relational life. And in these verses that I'm about to read to you, he's teaching how the church should be the church. Let me read to you from Galatians chapter 6. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore the person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. Nevertheless, the one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor. Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. But whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap the harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. This is the word of the Lord. So, did you notice that in the heart of these verses is a paradox? Paul says in the space of a few words that you must bear each other's burdens. And then he says, carry your own load. What I'm going to say in the next few minutes is basically how do we make sense of that. But let's just dig in. This is how I see it. So it feels to me like, if you think back to last week and the weeks running up to it, the whole thing, this whole section of Galatians feels like a kind of volume drop, where Paul has been basically shouting at the Galatians, and now he's kind of reduced to a more kind of sort of manageable volume, if you like. But my contention is that he's not really changed direction into some of the, oh, and by the way, he's actually continuing and reinforcing his own argument. He's just been talking about what it is to live a life driven by the Spirit versus a life where you are driven by the flesh. Now bear in mind, those don't quite work in, those two categories don't quite work in the way that we think. We think flesh means our material lives, our physical selves, and that Paul is condemning that, or it can sound like that. Paul is not doing that. Both the flesh and the Spirit are kind of different logics at work in our body, if you can put it like that, different ways that our lives are powered. Is your life powered by the concerns of the flesh, or is your life powered by the concerns of the Spirit? Anyway, and he's saying to the Galatians, you need to live by the Spirit, and you'll bear the fruit of the Spirit. Keep in step with the Spirit. And this is what you'll look like. You'll have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so on and so forth. But there is a slight sort of change in tone, but it's worth saying first off, but Paul is really realistic about community, because what's the first thing he says about it? People will fall into sin. People will get it wrong. People will break each other. People will injure each other. They will invest in the flesh, to borrow a phrase that Paul uses further down the line. But there is a way to deal with it. You spirit people, you people who are living by the Spirit, the Greek is pneumatikoi, should restore the person that's fallen into a sin. Now we don't actually know if Paul was referring to a specific sin that the Galatian churches had written to him about and say, oh, so and so's done this, we don't know what to do about him or her. It could have been something like that, and Paul just wanted to deal with it kind of anonymously, but we just don't know. But he is saying that the spiritual ones, the people who are driven by the Spirit, should act to restore that person. Elsewhere, Paul uses that Greek phrase, that pneumatikoi thing, as a bit of a kind of wind-up for people that think they're kind of hugely spiritually gifted. Because, okay, you kind of spiritual people, but here, I don't think he is doing that. I don't think he's using it in a sort of gently mocking way. Here, I think he's being very simple. People who are characterised by the fruit of the Spirit are qualified to look to each other and restore others in all gentleness. And of course, that is one of the fruit of the Spirit. One of the fruits, the part of the fruit of the Spirit, I should say, is gentleness. So, if you are living an ordinary Christian life where you're powered by the fruit of the Spirit, you are licensed, you have the right and the ability and the opportunity to speak into other people's life and lift them up when they fall. And that is a thing that you will never hear almost anywhere else in our culture right now, because we think that it is a huge transgression of boundaries to begin to address someone in what we think is their private life. It's the kind of thing we just don't do. Or, of course, we do it all the time, but we do it at a distance on social media in kind of shouty and judgmental ways. We don't do it in community, and we don't do it in any way marked by a spirit of gentleness, or marked by the mark of the Spirit who is gentle. But we have and are asked to and are obliged in our community to lift each other up. There is a ministry of truth, in other words, and there is a ministry of tears. We are obliged, are asked to, are motivated to look to each other and lift each other up when we are tripping up, when we are falling down, when we are getting things wrong. But there is also a ministry of tears. Truth and tears hold the tension. You lift them up, but you do it gently. Restore, lift up, challenge, but not in a bossy, interfering, or self-righteous way. Do it like that, and you're immediately disqualifying yourself from the ministry of truth-telling, if I can put it like that. In fact, there are two ways to disqualify yourself from being involved in this way in other people's lives. One is to tell the truth without gentleness. And we would all have probably seen instances of that, where somebody's just come in really hard and been really harsh with someone else and said, you know that thing you're doing is just wrong, you need to sort it out. And that is a disqualification. That's not gentle. But there is another way to disqualify ourselves, and that is being gentle without the truth. Of being so respectful of another person that we let some destructive pattern of speech or behaviour to dominate them and dominate others. So we have to hold together, hold in tension the ministry of truth and the ministry of tears and ministry of lifting people up gently. This is what it is, and Paul is beginning, of course, to speak about bearing the burden of another person. So the Spirit invites us to get to know our brothers and sisters well enough that you become exposed to the messy business of who they actually are, rather than their polite, or worse, their religious presentation of who they are. Because that's what's happened. You know, in these groups, in these communities, we do that. We kind of get together and we kind of project an impression of ourselves that says, you know, I'm okay, or I behave well, or I'm fine, or I'm doing everything right. Don't mind me. That's what we do. But the Spirit invites us to get to know each other in the kind of complexity and the messiness, to lift up those that have tripped up and to bear the burdens of others. If you ever read one Christian book in your life, ever, if you were just to read one, you should read Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which is only about 70 pages long. It'll take you about a few hours to read. That's just a book recommendation. It is the most incredible insight into what it is to live in Christian community. He says this: the most experienced psychologist or observer of human nature knows infinitely less of the human heart than the simplest Christian who lives beneath the cross of Jesus. The greatest psychological insight, ability, and experience cannot grasp this one thing: what sin is. Worldly wisdom knows what distress and weakness and failure are, but it does not know the godlessness of man, and so also does not know that man is destroyed only by his sin and can be healed only by his forgiveness. Only the Christian knows this. In the presence of a psychiatrist, I can only be a sick man. In the presence of a Christian brother or sister, I can dare to be a sinner. The psychiatrist must first search my heart, and yet he never plumbs its ultimate depth. The Christian brother knows when I come to him. Here is a sinner like myself, a godless man who wants to confess and yearns for God's forgiveness. I am certainly not against good counselling, whether Christian or secular, but there is a truth here when we know that we can see our brothers or sisters more as they are than someone with 3 degrees, a PhD, and professional qualifications can see them. And it's not that everything boils down to sin, it's just everything boils down to our brokenness. And some things, and sometimes that brokenness gets so heavy that it brings people to their knees and they need help to stand on their feet. So look around you. I just invite you to look around you. Just eyeball some of the people in front and behind. The people that you are looking at carry heavy loads. They carry heavy loads. Each of you carries heavy loads. And it might be loads of your heart and loads of your histories. It might be loads in your workplace or in your relationships. When the church is the community which takes time to consider each other. And that is the joy and the cost of community. And why the kind of sentimental presentations are kind of, they point us towards what we all deeply, deeply desire, which is a community, a kind of authentic community. But they're false in a way. They're a false hope. Because the joy and the cost of community is that we look around each other and we know that each of us is a sinner, each of us is bearing loads, each of us is tripping, each of us is stumbling, each of us needs lifting up. How can we do that? Well, I have all the answers. Come back next week. No.